A woman walks out of prison after 14 years and returns to her childhood lighthouse, only to find another family living there and papers saying she's been dead for years. Welcome to Deb's Story Haven. Before we begin, comment which city you're watching from. And when the story ends, rate it from 0 to 10 and tell us what you felt. If you love emotional twists, hidden betrayals, and truths that hit like a storm, follow Deb's Story Haven so you don't miss the next story. Now breathe in, and let's begin. Rhea Calder stepped off the prison transport with no ceremony and no one waiting. The correctional officer didn't even bother to say goodbye. Her feet met the gravel like it had betrayed her too, as if the ground had changed shape in the 14 years since she last walked on it freely. In her hands was a paper bag that held the few items she'd collected during her sentence, a paperback with a cracked spine, a rosary she didn't believe in anymore, a plastic comb, and a letter she'd never sent. She carried them close to her chest as though they might still mean something outside those walls. But her mind wasn't in the present, it was dragging her up the coast to the lighthouse. The last place her life had been her own. She didn't need a map. Her body remembered the way. The cliffside was still a jagged shadow in the distance, but it looked different. As she drew closer, it became clear. The old white paint was gone, replaced with a cleaner blue-gray. The cracked shutters were now uniform, polished. There was a fence where there had never been a fence, neat, modern, wrong. She stopped just outside the gate. Her fingers hesitated above the latch, as if touching it might set off an alarm. Then she knocked. Once, twice, harder. Each strike was a demand to be known. The door swung open after a pause too long to be casual. A man stood there, maybe in his early 30s, holding a baby with one arm and gripping the edge of the door with the other. His uniform said law enforcement, but his face was just tired. He wasn't afraid of her, just uncertain, like he was trying to figure out if she was selling something or had the wrong address. Rhea spoke first, her voice already cracked before she finished the first sentence. "I'm Rhea Calder. I used to live here. This was my home." The man blinked, his brow furrowed. "Sorry, miss," he said, eyes flicking to the plastic bracelet still tied on her wrist. "We bought this place for years ago. From a woman named Marisol Calder." Rhea's stomach dropped. "That's my sister," she whispered. Before he could answer, another figure stepped into the doorway. A woman, dark-haired, younger than Rhea, with the cautious poise of someone who didn't like strangers, especially not ones in tattered clothes and prison shoes. She didn't speak right away. Her eyes found the bracelet, the bag, and Rhea's trembling hand on the gate. She reached out, not far, but enough to offer a bottle of water and a folded blanket from just inside the door. Rhea didn't take them immediately. She stared at the woman like she was a hallucination. "I don't understand," she murmured. "This is my house. I was born here." But the doorframe stood firm. The man cleared his throat and shifted the baby to his other shoulder. "We've got the papers. It was all legal." The baby started to fuss, his tiny body squirming against the man's chest, upset by the sharp energy that had infected the space. Rhea stepped back instinctively, guilt rushing up her throat, even though she had no idea what she had to feel guilty for. "The woman Nyara," he called her, stepped forward, then, holding out the blanket again, softer this time, as though the silence between them could be mended with fabric. "Please," Nyara said, the word heavy with a lilt that suggested English wasn't her first language. "You are cold." Rhea took it this time, but only to occupy her hands. 14 years, she said, more to herself than them. "I never thought I'd come back to this." Hollis, as she now realized the man was called, glanced between them, then said carefully, "Look, I don't know what happened, but maybe you should talk to someone at the county. They can explain the transfer. We bought it fair, paid everything through escrow. We didn't know anything about." He gestured vaguely toward her. "You," the word struck like a slap. Rhea forced herself to breathe. Her heart was sprinting and she needed to catch it. "I'm not blaming you," she said. "You didn't know, but someone sold you a house that wasn't theirs and told you I was dead." The silence that followed was longer, heavier. Nyara reached for the baby and took him from Hollis, bouncing gently on her hip while murmuring something in Portuguese to soft to catch. The baby quieted, watching Rhea with wide, unafraid eyes. Rhea looked away. She didn't want that kind of innocence to see her like this. "Can I?" she asked, voice barely audible. "Can I see it? Just the kitchen, maybe?" Hollis hesitated. His training said no, his face said maybe. Nyara gave him a small nod. The kind that happened between couples when trust had to be lent, not owned. But Hollis stepped outside instead, letting the door close behind him. "Sorry," he said gently. "It's not up to me. We have a baby. We don't know you. This is home now." That word again. Home. As if it could just pass from one set of hands to another. Rhea nodded once, slow. "Right," she said. Of course, she stepped back, but she didn't leave. Not yet. Something in her refused to. They didn't slam the door. That was the worst part. They closed it with care, like they didn't want to hurt her, but still did anyway. Rhea stood there another minute, then another, the blanket loose in her arms. She turned toward the edge of the property and sat on the stone wall she used to climb as a kid. From there, she could see the lighthouse rise behind the house, proud and familiar, like it hadn't aged a day. Her mother used to say it was built to survive storms. "If anything in this world is meant to last, it's that tower," she'd told Rhea once, brushing her daughter's hair with sea salt fingers. But now the tower was part of someone else's life. Its beam rotated out to sea, steady and blind. Rhea held the water bottle against her forehead and closed her eyes. Her legs ached. Her chest ached more. She wanted to scream, but she didn't have the breath. So she sat in silence, the way she had so many nights in her cell. She was free, but she wasn't home. She had no keys. No name that opened doors. Just this patch of dirt and memory that no longer recognized her. Eventually, she stood again. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cliff. She didn't know where to go next. The shelter downtown had a bed, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe she'd sleep in a booth at the all-night diner if they didn't kick her out. She walked slowly along the outside of the fence, tracing the perimeter of what was once hers. Every few feet, she caught a glimpse inside a garden where there used to be crab pots, solar lights where her father's rusted tools once hung. It wasn't just that someone had moved in. It was that they had erased the signs she'd ever been here at all. And that was when the real weight hit her, not just the loss of the house, or the years in prison, or the lie someone had told in her name. It was the deeper, colder truth: someone had taken her past and rewritten it. Declared her dead on paper. Sold her legacy like junk at a garage sale. Rhea clenched the blanket tighter around her shoulders, not for warmth, but to feel something that hadn't yet been taken. She had nothing, and still someone had found a way to steal more. She started to laugh, but it wasn't laughter. It was the sound of something breaking. Rhea paused just outside the lighthouse's line of sight, turning back one last time. The windows glowed amber now, the silhouette of Nyara rocking the baby just visible behind gauzy curtains. It looked warm in there, safe. She didn't begrudge them that. Not really. Not yet. Maybe someday she would. But tonight, she just wanted the truth. Just one truth. Because if her sister had sold the house, if the town had believed she was dead, then the past 14 years weren't a nightmare, they were a plan. A story told without her consent. She would find out how it started, who wrote it, why they wanted her gone. But first, she had to survive this night, and tomorrow, and the one after, because someone had tried to erase her and failed. As she walked toward the edge of town, feet blistering, blanket clutched close, Rhea Calder felt the first spark of what she hadn't let herself feel in years: fury. And it was warm enough to carry her forward. Rhea sat in the back of Hollis's patrol car, staring at the edge of the passenger seat like it might offer her a version of this day that didn't feel like a slow bleed. He had offered the ride as a gesture of decency, not punishment, but the irony of climbing into another locked space wasn't lost on her. She said nothing during the drive. Hollis tried to fill the silence, mentioning the name of the county clerk, how the paperwork could be sorted, how this all might be some bureaucratic mistake. But the words sounded distant, as if they were being spoken through water. When they pulled into the county records office, Rhea hesitated before getting out. Part of her still thought that if she said nothing, didn't look, didn't read it with her own eyes, none of this would be real. But she stepped out anyway. Inside, the clerk behind the glass took one look at her and stiffened, as if her very presence made the air heavier. Hollis spoke on her behalf. Rhea stood there, silent and frayed, until a stack of papers was slid under the partition. Birth certificate, transfer of property, death certificate. Her name on all of them, stamped and signed, like some twisted eulogy written in legalese. She didn't understand how it was possible. Her own death had been filed 2 years after her conviction, citing complications from an inmate altercation. It was clean, clinical, and utterly fabricated. The signature at the bottom. Marisol Calder stared back at her in the same looping script Ria remembered from birthday cards and forged report cards. Marisol had claimed the house as next of kin, filed the death certificate, and transferred the deed. There was a notarized statement confirming no other living relatives. Ria's jaw locked. Her eyes burned, but no tears came. The pain wasn't sharp. It was something deeper, a dull implosion. "Is this real?" she asked, voice hollow. Hollis nodded slowly. "It's official," he said, not unkindly. "But real? That's something else." The clerk avoided her eyes, retreating into the safety of clicking keys. Ria picked up the death certificate and ran her thumb over her own name. There was no grief in the document, no mention of the life she had lived, the years lost, just a line that erased her. Hollis cleared his throat and asked if she had anywhere to stay. She shook her head. He hesitated, then said there was a women's shelter on Maddox Street. He could call ahead, maybe secure a car. Every word that came out of his mouth felt more like an eviction. Back in the car, the silence returned, but it was sharper now. Ria clutched the documents in her lap like they might fall apart if she let go. "You know what it feels like?" she finally said, voice low. "It feels like I died in there, and the world just agreed." Hollis glanced at her, then quickly looked away. "I didn't know," he said, "about the sale, about the death filing. We just wanted a quiet place for the baby. We didn't know anyone got hurt." Ria didn't answer. She wasn't sure what to do with his guilt. It wasn't his. It didn't help. When they arrived outside the lighthouse again, the fog was thinner, but the ache in her chest was worse. Hollis got out first, opened the back door like a chauffeur, not a cop. Ria stepped out slowly, her limbs stiff, her dignity threadbare. Nyara stood at the edge of the porch, holding the baby against her chest, watching them with a guarded expression. Hollis started to explain, but Ria spoke over him. "The papers are legit. My sister sold you the house fair and square. After she declared me dead," the words tasted like rust. Nyara's expression softened. She said nothing, just shifted the baby to her other hip. For a moment, none of them moved. Then Hollis spoke. "You can't stay here, Ria. I'm sorry. We have to think of Saul." His voice didn't waver, but the apology sat heavily between them. Ria nodded. "I know." She turned to leave, but Nyara stepped down from the porch and walked toward her. "Where will you sleep tonight?" she asked, her accent bending the sentence into something gentler. Ria opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't know. The streets, maybe. A church pew. A bench near the coast if it wasn't too cold. Nyara didn't push. She just reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. She pressed it into Ria's palm, closing the older woman's fingers around it. "You don't have to disappear," she said, each word deliberate. Ria looked down. A phone number. Nothing more. Nyara stepped back then, not expecting thanks, just offering something that felt a little like hope. Hollis didn't intervene. He just looked tired in a way that said he had no idea how to fix what had been broken long before he arrived in this town. Ria turned away and walked toward the edge of the property, the folded paper tucked into her pocket like a secret she wasn't sure she was allowed to keep. The sun had dipped low enough that the sky was painted in the bruised shades of dusk. Ria made her way around the fence until she reached the old stone boulder near the bluff, the one she used to climb with her father to watch ships roll in. It was still damp from the mist, but she sat on it anyway, letting the cold seep into her bones. The lighthouse stood tall behind her, lit from within by the golden glow of a home she no longer belonged to. Through the living room window, she could see the blur of movement, Nyara bouncing the baby, Hollis disappearing briefly into a hallway, someone laughing faintly on the television. All the small signs of a life in motion, a life that had replaced hers. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the note, smoothing the crumpled edges with a shaking hand. The ink had already begun to smear from where her palm had sweated against it. She stared at the message, "You don't have to disappear," like it might vanish before her eyes. She hadn't cried at the courthouse. She hadn't cried when she saw her name listed as deceased. But now, watching the home she once knew be lived in by strangers who didn't mean to hurt her, she finally let her guard crack. The tears weren't loud or dramatic. They were quiet, slipping down her face one after another, carving rivers through 14 years of endurance. Freedom, she realized, wasn't what people thought it was. Freedom didn't mean release. It didn't mean return. It meant being cast into a world that had moved on without you, a world that no longer had a place set for you at the table. She held the note tighter, as if it were an anchor. There was no bed waiting for her, no warm meal, No mother's arms. Just the ache of displacement and the bitter knowledge that someone her sister had made sure of that. Rhea wiped her face with the back of her sleeve and looked up one last time at the lighthouse. The glow through the window shimmered slightly, distorted by a curtain or maybe her tears. It didn't matter, it wasn't hers anymore, and the truth sank in. Full and shattering prison hadn't been the end. It had been the waiting room. What came next, this wandering, this hunger for something that might never be returned, this was the real punishment. And she hadn't even begun to feel the full weight of it yet. The town didn't forget her face, they just wished it had stayed buried. As Rhea walked through the narrow streets of Halberd Bay, the air felt thicker than the mist. The first place she tried was the small diner by the harbor, where she and her father used to eat clam chowder on Sundays. The bell over the door gave its usual ring, but the conversation inside stopped on cue. A server, mid-pour with a pot of coffee, stared like she'd seen a ghost. One man in a booth whispered something that made the woman beside him shift uncomfortably. "Is that who I think it is?" Someone muttered, not low enough to go unheard. Rhea walked to the counter, unsure what she thought she'd get, but the woman behind the register didn't smile. She froze mid-smile, blinked at the prison release band still snug around Rhea's wrist, then busied herself with rearranging napkins. Rhea didn't blame her, not yet, but when she asked for a coffee, the woman didn't respond, just turned her back. Rhea left before anyone had to ask. As the doors swung shut behind her, someone near the window whispered, "Boat killer." It wasn't shouted. It didn't have to be. The venom was in the quiet, like truth didn't need proof when belief had already calcified. She tried the small convenience store next. The clerk, a man she recognized from school to decades ago, Pete Morley, who used to ride dirt bikes and spit sunflower seeds at recess, froze when she entered. His eyes scanned her up and down, then landed on the plastic band. "You shouldn't be here, Rhea," he said, not angrily, just flat. She stared at him for a moment. "You always did follow whatever everyone else was thinking," she said. Pete scoffed, but didn't argue. "They said you confessed, said there was a tape." Rhea nodded slowly. "There's a lot of things they said. Doesn't make 'em true," he shrugged. "Maybe, but folks remember the wreck, remember the body count." Her jaw clenched. "You think I forget? You think I don't see it every time I close my eyes?" Pete looked away. "Look, I ain't saying what's true or not. But if you're looking for kindness, this town cashed that out a long time ago." Rhea turned to leave, but before she stepped through the door, she looked back at him. "I'm not looking for kindness," she said. "I'm looking for someone who still remembers how to tell the truth." And with that, she stepped out and kept walking, unsure if she'd find either. It took her over an hour to work up the nerve to walk up the old wooden steps to the house on Ellery Street. She hadn't been there in years, but the way still lived in her body. Her father's friend, Cal Madsen, had always been a fixture of her childhood, a gruff, sea-tan man with a laugh like a chainsaw and a loyalty that once felt unshakable. When he answered the door, he didn't look shocked, just worn down. His hands were still as thick as ever, but slower now, spotted with age. "Cal," she said. Her voice almost broke, but she held it. "It's me." He studied her face like he was peeling it back to find the girl beneath. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "Didn't think I'd see you again." She waited for an invitation inside, but none came. He stepped halfway out instead, leaving the door cracked behind him. "She didn't ask to come in." "They said you testified," she said. "They said you vouched for the tape." Cal sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "I didn't vouch. I stayed quiet." "And that was the same thing, wasn't it?" Rhea's heart lurched. "You believed I did it." He didn't deny it. It was easier than believing the system could be that wrong. Easier to believe the evidence. She should have turned and left right then. But something in Cal's expression stopped her. A flicker of shame, maybe. He rubbed the back of his neck like he was trying to loosen guilt that had calcified into his spine. "But I saw something," he admitted. "Night of the sinking. I never told anyone." Rhea leaned forward, her stomach flipping. "What?" Cal nodded toward the sea, barely visible past the rooftops. There was another vessel out there. No lights, no movement, just floating. It was too far out to be a part of the tourist run, and too quiet to be a fishing boat. I figured it was the Coast Guard or some rich asshole doing midnight cruises. But it felt wrong." Rhea swallowed. "You didn't say anything?" He shook his head. "Didn't want to get involved. Didn't want to make waves. And Marisol, she came by the next morning. Said you were gone, and the evidence was strong. She looked me dead in the eye and said she knew it hurt, but justice was justice." Rhea laughed once, bitter and low. She convinced a whole town. Cal didn't argue. He disappeared inside for a moment and returned with something wrapped in a plastic bag. Here, he said, old logbook. I made a note that night. Didn't have the guts to bring it forward. Maybe it'll mean something now. Rhea took the bag like it was fragile. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped the worn leather-bound notebook. Inside, Cal's handwriting marked an entry, date, time, coordinates, unlit vessel sighted offshore, static, holding, no follow-up, no alert, just a single line, nearly forgotten. This could have helped, she said. Cal didn't meet her eyes. I know, he exhaled slowly. I was scared, not of you, of being wrong, of making enemies. You know what this town is like. They close ranks fast. Rhea nodded. Yeah, I noticed. He reached out as if to place a hand on her shoulder but stopped short. I'm sorry, Rhea, for staying quiet, for letting her rewrite you. Rhea slipped the notebook into her coat. Thank you, she said, for telling me now. He hesitated again. You think you'll clear your name? Rhea looked down the street, toward the lighthouse that was no longer hers. I don't know, she answered, but at least now I've got something real. Something they didn't get to edit. She turned before he could say more. She didn't want gratitude. She didn't want pity. She wanted a record. Something that proved she hadn't imagined it all. She walked back to town with the notebook hugged tight against her chest. The streets were less hostile now, maybe because fewer people were out, or maybe because the worst part had already happened. No one yelled. No one welcomed her either. She passed the diner again and didn't look in the window this time. She didn't need to. Her reflection didn't belong in those booths anymore. But the logbook in her jacket was warm from her body heat, and it grounded her. The tape hadn't been the whole truth. There had been another boat. Another presence. Something the court never saw because no one dared speak. And now she had it. Proof. Maybe not yet, but a start. As she reached the edge of the bluff, the sea came into full view, churning, cold, endless. It had taken so much from her, but it remembered. Even if the people forgot, the sea had witnessed everything. The wreck, the lies, the silence. And now, with Cal's words echoing in her ears, Rhea understood what kind of justice she was after. Not revenge, not forgiveness, just the truth. One piece at a time. She stared out at the water, jaw set. The sea kept its secrets, but not forever. People chose theirs, and she was done letting them. They didn't look at her like a person when she first walked into the Cascadia Innocence Clinic. They looked at her like a headline. That was always the first wound the thin, practiced smiles of law students trying to be professional as they flicked through her file, eyes catching on words like manslaughter, premeditation, recorded confession. It didn't matter that she sat right there in front of them, flesh and breath and 14 years of silence. To them, she was a case study, a hard one, too, a long shot. They assigned her to a young attorney named Lark Wren, maybe 29, maybe 30, hair pulled back to tightly, dark circles beneath his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept through the night since law school. Rhea didn't expect much. But when she sat across from him in a windowless office that smelled faintly of mildew and printer toner, something shifted. Lark didn't speak for the first full minute. He just let the silence stretch. No interruptions, no affirmations. And when he did finally speak, it wasn't with skepticism, it was with the careful patience of someone who'd already learned to listen for what didn't make it into court transcripts. Tell me everything, he said. Start with the night it happened. And don't leave out the parts you think sound unbelievable. She did. It took her 2 hours. She told him about the boat, the confusion, the sudden explosion of sound, about how her sister had come to her days before, frightened and whispering about something she'd uncovered, about someone dangerous watching them. How she had handed Rhea the microtape in the parking lot of a Shell station off Route 6, saying, if something happens to me, you give this to someone who can do something. Rhea never asked what was on it. She'd trusted her sister. At the time, that had seemed natural. Now it felt like the first in a long line of naive mistakes. When she pulled the microtape from her coat pocket wrapped in the same cheap plastic bag she'd protected for over a decade, Lark didn't scoff. He didn't treat it like a relic. He took it with both hands, as if it might break under the weight of its own history. We'll have it tested, he promised. We won't jump to conclusions. For the first time in weeks, Rhea didn't feel like she had to brace for the next impact. She left the office that day with her throat tight and her fingers numb. But something new had begun to form under her skin, not hope exactly, but the ghost of it. When the call came 3 days later, Lark's voice was neutral. Too neutral. Can you come in today? He asked. We've finished analyzing the tape. That was all he said. It was enough to bring back the prison-fueled anxiety that lived behind her ribs. She returned to the clinic with the same sense of dread she'd had every time a warden summoned her to an unexpected meeting. Inside the small office, Lark had his laptop open, a waveform paused mid-spike on the screen. We isolated everything, he said. Cleaned the background, matched timestamps, ran voice pattern recognition. He hit play. Rhea listened as her own voice filled the room. She sounded calm. Too calm. She heard herself relaying coordinates, confirming a rendezvous, giving instructions. It was surgical, damning, airtight. It sounded like she was coordinating a crime, a cover-up, and a getaway. Her heart thudded once, painfully. That's not me, she whispered. Lark nodded. It is, he said. But it isn't. He paused the playback and pointed to the screen. Listen to the ambient hum. It changes between words. And this? He clicked on a timestamp. This segment uses phrasing from a phone call you had with your sister 6 months before the incident. We pulled it from prison records. It's been spliced, artificially constructed. Rhea couldn't speak. Her jaw was clenched tightly, her hands gripping the armrests as if she might fall into the floor. Someone cut together my voice, she said finally. They built this. Lark gave a slight nod. With enough audio, you can simulate almost anything. Especially when people want to believe what they're hearing. He leaned back, rubbed his face. The signature on this work. It's methodical, practiced. Whoever did this wasn't just trying to make you look guilty, they were making sure no one would ever doubt it. Rhea felt her breath catch, as if something inside her had snapped taut. The last 14 years of self-control began to wobble under the weight of that sentence. I thought this tape would save me, she said. Her voice was thin now, barely there. All these years, I thought I was holding the truth. Her eyes locked on the laptop speaker like it had betrayed her. Lark said nothing. He didn't try to comfort her. Maybe he understood that nothing would help, not right now. So he sat with her in the silence. And when she finally exhaled, it was not a sob but a single, dry noise, a rupture in her chest. She pressed a hand over her face. Someone didn't just frame me. They trained for it. Lark finally spoke again, this time more carefully. This gives us something to work with. The inconsistencies, the timestamps, they all point to manipulation. It won't be easy, but we can challenge it. The court won't like being lied to. Rhea shook her head. They'll say it was an error. They'll find a way to say it doesn't change anything. She stood, pacing now, blood returning to her limbs in jolts. Who had the motive to go this far? Who even has access to that kind of audio? Lark was already ahead of her. The insurance angle, the beneficiary, the original ownership transfer. If we trace that money, we might find the source. Rhea nodded, distracted. Her hands moved to her face again, pressing against her eyes as if she could squeeze the disbelief out. I've been sitting on this tape like it was gold, she muttered. All this time, I was guarding the knife they used to gut me. Lark didn't interrupt. He just let her speak, let the words fall where they needed. And that alone, the space to feel fury instead of shame, felt more powerful than anything she'd been given since the trial. But it didn't make the weight go away. It only made her more certain of one thing: this wasn't just sabotage. This had been orchestrated. When she finally left the clinic hours later, the world looked no different than when she arrived, but Rhea was. She didn't cry again. Not after the first sob, the one that had ripped itself free in Lark's office without warning. What she carried now wasn't grief, it was fire. Whoever had built that tape had known her voice intimately, had cut her like a surgeon, not a butcher. It meant planning, access. It meant someone close. Her mind reeled, landing again and again on Marisol's calm smile in that courtroom gallery. The way she had dabbed at fake tears while Rhea's life was dismantled piece by piece. Rhea walked without knowing exactly where she was going, only that her steps were leading her somewhere solid. She didn't know yet how she'd fight, or who would stand beside her, but she knew this: she wasn't crazy. She hadn't imagined the betrayal. And the tape? It wasn't her confession. It was someone else's blueprint. She pulled her coat tighter, pressed the clinic's business card deeper into her pocket, and kept walking. Not toward forgiveness, not toward peace, but toward the thing she had wanted for 14 years more than anything else: clarity. Because now she knew someone hadn't just framed her. Someone had practiced her ruin. Rhea returned to the lighthouse not with a sense of vengeance, but with the question that had begun to burn a hole through every waking thought: who sold it to you? The past few days had taught her that truth was never handed over willingly. It had to be pulled out, piece by ugly piece. As she reached the gate, she half expected the door to be shut in her face, or worse, to be met with the polite defensiveness people used to handle a ticking bomb. Instead, before she even raised her hand to knock, Nyara opened the door. Her expression wasn't surprised. It was almost like she'd been waiting. No fanfare, no dramatic pause, just a quiet nod, a soft gesture to step in from the wind. Rhea hesitated. But something about the way Nyara moved, gently shifting a baby bouncer out of the entryway, guiding her to sit without speaking, and placing a cup of tea in front of her without asking whether she wanted it, disarmed her in ways she wasn't ready for. These weren't grand invitations. They were the kind of small gestures that didn't ask questions, but told you you matter enough to be made space for. Rhea sat stiffly at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around the mug, unsure if she'd cry or bolt. The baby, Saul, cooed from his seat nearby, his chubby hands reaching aimlessly until one finger brushed against Rhea's wrist. She looked down, startled by the contact. Saul gripped her finger with quiet, unfiltered trust, completely unaware of who she was or what the town said about her. Rhea's throat tightened. She hadn't been touched like that in years. Not gently, not without conditions. Hollis entered then, slower than Nyara, with the caution of someone still figuring out whether to treat her like a threat or a guest. He sat across from her, one hand resting near his holstered belt out of habit more than intention. "We didn't know, Rhea," he said. "When we bought this place, it was all in order. Deed, notarized transfer, the works." Rhea met his eyes, and for the first time, he didn't look away. "Who signed it?" she asked. Hollis shifted uncomfortably. Marisol Calder, listed as next of kin, filed the transfer about 8 years ago. There was a death certificate. Rhea's lips tightened. "Says I died in custody." He nodded. "I'm sorry." It all looked official. She could see the discomfort in him, the war between believing the papers and believing the woman in front of him. Rhea didn't expect him to pick a side. Not yet, but she needed the facts, and now she had them. Nyara hadn't spoken through most of this exchange. She watched Rhea's face with something deeper than pity, something that felt like recognition. And then, in the quiet that followed Hollis's admission, she said it: "I know what it's like to be erased." The sentence came out softly, but it sliced through the room like a razor. Rhea turned her head slowly. "What do you mean?" she asked, careful not to push too hard. Nyara shook her head. "Another time," she said, but her hand remained on the edge of the table, just a few inches from Rhea's. Not reaching, not inviting, just there. A presence. Rhea stared at it for a moment, then looked back at Saul, who was now chewing on the corner of a soft toy with total contentment. "I thought I'd come here angry," Rhea admitted. "I thought I'd scream, demand things, but you didn't take anything. It was already taken before you got here." Hollis lowered his gaze. "We don't want to be in the middle of this." "You are," Rhea said, "and I think you know that now." The silence was uncomfortable, but not hostile. It was the kind that exists between people realizing they're all casualties of the same lie. Hollis leaned forward slightly. "So what happens next?" Rhea shrugged. "I don't know. I don't have a plan. Not yet, but I need to know everything about the sale. When it happened, who processed it, where the money went." Hollis nodded slowly. "I can pull what I have. The realtor's name, county filings. Maybe Nyara can check the digital records. She's better with computers than I am." Nyara smiled faintly, almost shyly, and nodded. "I'll look." It was the first time Rhea felt something that resembled alliance, even if it was unspoken. She didn't expect them to pick up her fight, but neither did they seem eager to push her away now that the cracks in the story were starting to show. The house didn't feel like hers anymore. Not even close, but it didn't feel like a battlefield either. The hostility she'd braced for was absent, replaced by a hesitant willingness to understand. Maybe it was because of Saul, who babbled at nothing in particular, occasionally glancing at her with unfiltered curiosity. Maybe it was because Nyara recognized something in Rhea that others didn't: what it meant to be cut out of your own story. Either way, Rhea wasn't alone in the room anymore. Not really. The tea had gone cold. Rhea didn't touch it, but she remained seated for a while longer, watching Nyara open her laptop, watching Hollis disappear into a side room and return with a small manila folder. "These are the originals we received," he said, placing it on the table. Copies of the deed, seller affidavit, transfer documents. I didn't look too hard at them before. Maybe I should have. Ria reached for the folder, her fingers brushing Nyara's on the edge of the table. Neither of them pulled away. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was something. As Ria skimmed the first few pages, the fake signature jumped out at her. Marisol had even forged the contact number. There was no way to trace it back to a real address. She covered every trail, Ria whispered. Hollis frowned. But we might still find one. Ria looked up, the weight of the folder grounding her. Thank you, both of you. You didn't have to help. Nyara met her gaze and said, sometimes, not helping is the same as hurting. Ria didn't respond, but her chest ached with the pressure of unshed emotion. Not grief. Not yet. Something sharper, something with edges, maybe even the beginning of belief. As she stood to leave, Saul reached again for her, and this time she didn't hesitate. She let his fingers close around hers, his grip clumsy but sincere. Nyara didn't flinch at the contact. Hollis didn't tense. It wasn't trust, not fully, but it was the beginning of something different, recognition, maybe, of wounds that weren't visible, of battles quietly fought. Ria didn't say goodbye. She just nodded, slipping the folder under her arm. Her other hand still holding the note Nyara had once given her, the one that now felt less like pity and more like a promise. As she stepped outside, her boots crunching on gravel, the weight of the documents didn't feel heavy. Not this time. It felt like direction. She had walked into the lighthouse expecting a fight. What she found was a fracture in the wall she thought she'd have to scale alone. And that changed everything. Not the past, but maybe the path forward. For the first time since her release, her anger wasn't blazing. It had cooled into something more focused, less wildfire, more blade. And it had a name now, purpose. Hollis didn't know when he'd crossed the line from cautious observer to active conspirator, but it became clearer each time he bypassed a password he wasn't supposed to have or dug through sealed reports after hours. The badge clipped to his belt, once a symbol of order, now felt like a dare. He knew what could happen if anyone found out what he was doing, not just a suspension, but full termination, or worse, prosecution. But the deeper he looked into the official records surrounding the Lighthouse sale, the more the facts twisted. Late one night, after convincing a night shift clerk to double-check something for a housing dispute, he found it a property transfer initiated under the name Marisol Calder with supporting documentation that listed Ria as deceased. But what made him pause wasn't the transfer itself, it was the routing path. A secondary channel, flagged once and then sealed. It wasn't supposed to be there. He followed it through archived dispatch logs and found a mention of a private radio relay tower that was no longer active. A call had been routed through it the night of the sinking, logged under a temporary code with no listed operator. That wasn't just a red flag. It was a fire alarm. Someone had used off-grid infrastructure to move a message that never made it into trial evidence. Back at the lighthouse, Hollis tried to maintain normalcy, but the tension leaked into everything. Nyara noticed first. She always did. She saw it in the way he closed his laptop faster than usual or double-checked locks without explaining why. One evening, as he reviewed a grainy PDF scan of the radio tower report, she stood behind him silently, her arms crossed. You're getting involved, she said, not as an accusation but a fact. More than you should, he didn't argue. Just looked at her and said, someone lied big enough to bury a person alive. I can't pretend I don't see it now. Nyara didn't tell him to stop. She walked away without another word, but from that moment, her posture changed. She was quieter, tenser. Every time a police car passed on the road below, she froze. Not dramatically, just for a second, like her lungs forgot how to work. That night, long after Saul had gone to sleep, she found Ria in the kitchen, staring at a spreadsheet of names and case file codes Lark had sent her. I need to tell you something, Nyara whispered, sitting across from her. I overstayed my visa years ago. I've been hiding ever since. Every form, every file, it all feels like a trap. Her voice cracked, and she looked away. Ria didn't speak at first. She reached across the table and gently touched Nyara's hand. The contact said everything. Ria knew that kind of fear intimately, the one that curled around your ribs and lived in your breath. The kind that made survival feel like a performance you couldn't afford to fail. We're both one mistake away from being erased, Ria said, her voice raw. Different reasons. Same fear, Nyara nodded. Saul makes it worse. Makes it matter more, Ria gave a dry laugh. Funny, I never wanted kids. I didn't think I'd survive long enough to raise one. But she paused, thinking of Saul's soft hand in hers days ago. How easily he trusted. How unaware he was of the firestorm circling the adults in his life. He reminds me why the truth matters. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was no point. They both understood what it meant to build a life on paper-thin ground. When Hollis joined them a few minutes later, holding a printed email with redacted names and routing instructions for the call log, he said one thing: it's not just bad, it's engineered. The weight of his words settled over them like fog. Rhea folded the papers carefully, then reached for her notebook and started writing names, connections, timelines. The picture was becoming clearer and uglier. The media, meanwhile, had begun its quiet celebration of Marisol Calder. News clips circulated on local and national networks, interviews of her standing at ocean cleanup fundraisers, cutting ribbons at marine preservation centers, speaking in practiced tones about the dignity of those lost at sea. One clip showed her on a Seattle rooftop garden at a gala, smiling graciously as a reporter praised her work. "You've built so much good," the anchor gushed, "especially in light of such personal tragedy, losing your sister in such a devastating accident." Marisol tilted her head, nodded with appropriate solemnity, and offered a soft, "She was strong. We all carry her spirit." But it was the next moment that shattered Rhea's composure. The camera cut wide, catching Marisol as she looked away just for a second and smiled. It wasn't the smile of grief. It was involuntary, smug, the kind of curl at the corner of the mouth that no publicist could coach away. Rhea replayed it for times, 5, then 10. She paused it on the exact frame where the truth peeked out like a crack in polished glass. "There it is," she whispered. "You can fake a signature, you can fake a tape, but you can't fake a moment like that." Hollis and Nyara watched the clip too. No one disagreed. Later that night, Rhea sat at the small desk in her borrowed room, pulling out the folder she'd started assembling documents, names, scribbled notes, timelines, receipts. She flipped to a blank page and wrote one thing in the center: Marisol Calder. The ink bled slightly from the pressure of her pen. She stared at the name like it was a wound. She thought of all the people who had smiled when they heard Marisol's name, all the doors she'd opened with charm and philanthropy. Meanwhile, Rhea had been rotting in a cell for a crime that had made her sister a star. The sound of applause echoed in her memory now, not the literal kind, but the metaphorical one. The approval Marisol had been fed on, the accolades built on Rhea's stolen life. "They clapped while I was dying," she murmured. It wasn't melodrama, it was fact. Every ribbon Marisol cut had been tied with the strings of Rhea's silence. She felt her pulse throb in her neck and steadied her breath. "Not anymore," she said aloud. She folded the page and tucked it behind the others, sealing the name inside her growing archive of truths. She didn't need revenge, she needed exposure, and now, she had a face to aim for. As the clock ticked past midnight, Rhea sat with the weight of everything. Hollis was risking his job, Nyara was risking her safety, and Rhea, for the first time in over a decade, was no longer risking her life, she was reclaiming it. There was still a long way to go, and no one in this triangle of fragile trust had illusions of safety. But there was solidarity now, and that was no small thing. Somewhere in Seattle, Marisol was still being celebrated for a story that never belonged to her. But that applause, Rhea finally understood what it was. It wasn't just praise, it was the sound of her own stolen years echoing in someone else's spotlight. And she was done listening to it. She closed the notebook, eyes steady, jaw set. One way or another, she would make the truth louder than the lie. And this time, she wouldn't be alone. The email came late, unsigned, routed through an encrypted platform the clinic used for whistleblower tips. Lark read it 3 times before forwarding it to Rhea. The sender only identified himself as a man who served a king, and said he had documents that would crack open the story behind the sea. It sounded like a riddle until he mentioned the name Edwin Harker. Rhea froze when she saw it. Harker had been a titan in the marine insurance world, dubbed the ocean's banker by magazines before his sudden, fatal accident aboard the tourist vessel the night everything fell apart. She remembered his face, square jaw, thin mouth, always flanked by men in tailored suits. What the public didn't know was that Harker had been whisper close with Marisol during the year leading up to the tragedy. Rhea had seen texts once, had overheard a few odd late-night calls, but never pressed. Now she knew better. When Lark arranged the meeting, it was on neutral ground, a quiet corner of a university library. Edwin showed up in a blazer that didn't fit quite right, and hands that shook more from conscience than age. "I'm not doing this for you," he told Rhea as he sat down. I'm doing it because I helped build the lie, and now I can't sleep. He handed over a folder, so old it smelled like cardboard and nicotine. Ria opened it carefully, page by page, letting her fingers linger on each one as if afraid they might vanish. There were policy documents, pages stamped and notarized naming a beneficiary switched just weeks before the explosion. Marisol called her. There were also shell company listings, bank transfers split across 3 countries, and most damning Harker's private travel log, which placed Marisol near the Oregon coast the exact week she had claimed to be in Tokyo attending a sustainability summit. Lark, seated beside Ria, flipped through the documents with increasing intensity. This isn't just sketchy, he said. It's deliberate. Edwin nodded solemnly. The payout was triggered by a unique clause tied to a mass maritime casualty. That clause shouldn't have been there in the first place. It was custom, quiet, and worth over $12 million. Ria swallowed the bile in her throat. $12 million. That was the number her life had been weighed against. That was the price tag of her silence, her cage, her erasure. Edwin leaned forward. I knew what we were doing wasn't clean. But I didn't know he'd die. I didn't know she'd let them pin it all on you. She told me it was contained. It took all of Ria's control not to shake him. Why come forward now? She asked, her voice brittle. Edwin's eyes shimmered. Because I saw her on the news last week, speaking at some gala, smiling like the world owed her something. And I thought, how long can a person live inside a lie before it eats them from the inside? Lark slid the folder into his briefcase. Do you have anything else? Edwin hesitated, then pulled out a flash drive. This has copies. I couldn't get everything, but there's enough to show the money trail. I made backups, in case I ended up in a ditch. Ria took it with both hands. I hope it's enough. Edwin stood to leave but turned before walking away. I always thought you were just collateral, but I think now he faltered you were the target all along. When he disappeared around the library stacks, Lark looked at Ria. We're not dealing with just a cover-up. This was a design, a machine. Ria nodded, the folder still pressed to her chest. And now we know where the engine started. Her hands were shaking, but her spine had never felt straighter. For the first time, they weren't chasing shadows. They had names, accounts, locations. They also had a problem, how to trace money that had been buried on purpose. That's where Marcus Vale came in. A former federal investigator turned private. Vale was the kind of man who rarely made a second entrance because his first impression never left. Lark reached out through an old colleague. When Ria met Marcus, he didn't ask for her story. He asked for the evidence. He combed through the folder, the flash drive, and then leaned back, lips pursed. Shell companies are like Russian dolls, he said, but every doll has a seam. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus traced one account to another, following signatures, false addresses, and recycled INs until he found something, a payment made to a medical facility under a name that didn't show up in any registry. Wellness at dusk, he said, sliding a printout across the table to Ria. Luxury rehab, new identities, clean records. It's where people go when they want to disappear while pretending they're being found. The clinic was in the California desert, a place with wide gates and silent staff. Marcus pulled out a photo captured by a source near the facility. A woman stepping out of a shaded archway, her hair shorter now, her face narrower, sunglasses covering half her expression but not enough. Ria knew that walk, that posture. That's her, Ria said quietly. Marcus nodded. Goes by the name Karina Dorn now. Supposedly an author recovering from burnout. Ria's hands clenched. She always did know how to sell a tragedy. Lark tapped the edge of the printout. We'll need more than a photo. We'll need her voice, her signature, her presence. Ria stared at the picture like it might blink back at her. I'll get it, she said. I don't care how. She stood, gripping the photo like a relic, her mind already racing. Marcus leaned forward. You sure you're ready for this? Ria didn't look away from the photo. I was ready the moment I heard my own voice say words I never spoke. There was nothing theatrical in her tone. Just resolve. Cold, measured, and real. She didn't just take my name, Ria added. She took my years, my mother's house, my future. Her voice cracked, but her eyes didn't. She doesn't get to keep the ending too. Marcus and Lark exchanged a glance, then nodded. It wasn't their job to stop her. It was their job to help her finish this properly, legally, and if possible, completely. That night, alone in her room, Ria spread the documents across the bed like a crime scene. Not just for study, but as a reckoning. She read through the insurance terms again, the polished language that had blood in its folds. She stared at the travelogue, imagining Marisol booking flights under different names, rerouting accounts while planning eulogies. There were receipts from hotels near the marina, invoices from yacht repairs, even a handwritten itinerary with cryptic notes that made sense now only in hindsight. Stake 9 if it goes bad. You 6 Ria didn't know what it meant yet, but she would. Everything would come to light, one rotten truth at a time. She reached for the photo again. Marisol, or Karina now, stepping into sunlight like she hadn't torn a life apart. You changed your name, Ria whispered, but you didn't outrun me. She folded the photo and placed it inside a new file, labeling it with the single word desert. Then she added a second folder, Seattle, one for where it began, one for where it would end. Her path had split the day the boat sank. Now it was converging again, and this time, she was the one steering. They found her in the desert, nestled in a gated enclave where silence was curated and discomfort erased by design. The greenery was synthetic in spirit if not in substance, carefully maintained lawns and imported palm trees framing rows of beige villas that looked more like high-end recovery rooms than homes. Marisol, or Karina Dorn as she called herself now, lived in one of the most secluded units, her name never listed on the mailbox, her presence only whispered about by staff. Marcus got them in under the pretense of an investment consult, with Ria posing as his associate. The second Ria stepped into the shaded patio where Marisol waited, time buckled. 14 years collapsed into the width of a breath. Marisol didn't gasp or stumble. She simply blinked once, slowly, like someone who had finally been caught by a consequence she spent a decade pretending didn't exist. She wore a silk robe and large sunglasses, but even they couldn't hide the shadows in her cheeks or the faint tremor in her hands. Her illness had done what courts couldn't, etched fragility into the woman who once moved through the world like it owed her applause. Ria, she said, voice smooth, calculated, like a donor event greeting. I wondered when you'd come. Ria didn't reply at first. She sat opposite her sister at the small patio table, letting the space between them fill with everything and said. Marisol reached for a glass of water with fingers that shook just slightly, not enough for someone untrained to notice, but Ria saw it. She saw everything. How did you find me? Marisol asked, still playing the performance. It doesn't matter, Ria said. You know why I'm here. There was no raised voice, no accusation hurled across the table, just a quiet certainty that made Marisol flinch harder than if Ria had screamed. I was told you died, she said. Ria smiled, cold, unkind. And you were the one who told them? Marisol tried to offer a version of regret, the kind that could pass as empathy in a boardroom. It got out of control. The evidence was overwhelming. I thought it was over. You thought I'd disappear, Ria corrected. You made sure of it. She reached into her bag and pulled out a copy of the altered tape transcript, setting it gently on the table between them. You practiced my voice. You fed it to them. Then you smiled for the cameras while I starved in a cage. Marisol didn't deny it. Her mouth twitched, her eyes glistened, but she said nothing. When Ria asked about the microtape, how Marisol had orchestrated the spliced audio, the routing through the private relay, the phantom call that nailed her into the coffin, something inside Marisol stuttered. Her hand gripped the armrest of the chair, too tightly. I didn't do it alone, she said, after a pause too long to feel honest. There were others. Edwin, the policy man. Harker knew what he was ensuring. He just didn't expect to die. Ria leaned in slightly. You handed me that tape like it was a lifeline. But it was a fuse, wasn't it? Marisol's breath hitched. I told myself it was protection. For me, if things went bad, it was a weapon, Ria said. Built with my voice and your greed. Marisol looked away. The act was crumbling. She wasn't the philanthropic darling anymore. She was a dying woman in a robe, hiding from the past in curated silence. The quiet stretched again, only this time Marisol didn't fill it with practiced warmth. She stared at her own lap, then said something that caught Ria off guard, not because it was manipulative, but because it wasn't. I want to see the sea, Marisol murmured. Just once more, before it ends. I want to go back, to the lighthouse. The words dropped like a stone in water. Ria's first instinct was fury. How dare she? After all of this, after stealing her home, her years, her name, she wanted to return to the one place she had desecrated. Why? Ria asked, not as a sister, but as someone evaluating the last wish of a woman who'd sold her soul and expected redemption to arrive gift-wrapped. Because I can't remember if I ever saw it without guilt, Marisol said, her voice suddenly threadbare. I want to see it before I can't see anything. Rhea felt the rage swirl and twist, but it didn't explode. It just settled in her bones, heavy and bitter. She wanted to say no, wanted to tell her that the sea wasn't a gift, and she didn't get to make it sacred again after drowning it in lies. But something else surfaced beneath the fury. Not forgiveness, not even pity, just clarity. Death isn't justice, Rhea whispered, mostly to herself. But maybe it loosens the tongue. Marisol looked up sharply. So you'll take me? Rhea didn't nod, didn't speak. She just stared at the woman across from her, trying to recognize the sibling she once trusted. And then she said, "You'll come as a passenger, not as a sister." The terms were unspoken but understood. Rhea wasn't offering closure. She was offering a mirror, a return not to nostalgia but to the scene of the crime. Marisol gave a small nod and didn't argue. She looked smaller now, her shoulders folding in, her power gone. "I'll arrange it," Rhea said, rising to leave. "But not for you, for the truth." Marisol's hand fluttered toward the glass again, but she didn't lift it. "Thank you," she said. Rhea didn't reply. She walked back through the villa's polished interior, past staff who smiled without knowing who she was, carrying the weight of a promise she never thought she'd make. The desert air burned as she stepped outside, but it didn't sting as much as the silence behind her. The woman who'd built her kingdom on a lie was dying, and even that didn't feel like justice. But it felt like timing, like something was shifting. Back at the car, Marcus waited, watching her face carefully. "You get what you needed?" he asked. Rhea slid into the passenger seat, still seeing Marisol's shadow across the patio. "She wants to go back," she said. "To the lighthouse." Marcus didn't react with surprise. He just asked, "And what do you want?" Rhea looked ahead. "I want her to see what she buried." And that was why she agreed. Not out of grace, not out of mercy, but because the ocean didn't forget, and maybe, just maybe, in the shadow of the lighthouse she desecrated, Marisol would finally be forced to say what she did. Not to escape punishment, but to face the scale of what she'd destroyed. That was the leverage, not the threat of exposure, but the confrontation with memory. Rhea didn't believe in second chances, but she did believe in reckoning. And bringing her sister back to the cliff they both once called home felt like the only stage large enough for the truth to speak. Marisol was dying, but before she left this world, Rhea would make sure she looked the past in the face and saw it looking back. The drive back to the lighthouse had been tense, but by the time they reached the cliff's edge, the storm had already begun to hiss and claw at the coast. Hollis had tried to talk Rhea out of it, bringing Marisol back, even for a night. Felt like introducing poison into a wound that was just beginning to scab. But Rhea had insisted, not for reconciliation, not for peace, for the reckoning. Marisol had arrived hunched and quieter than Rhea remembered, wrapped in layers that clung to her thin frame like armor. But her eyes still flicked to every corner of the house like they owned it. Nyara helped her up the steps without a word. Hollis locked the front door behind them as the first flickers of lightning lit the edges of the sky. By the time dinner was cleared and the power cut out with the groan of the wind, the storm had fully swallowed the hill. Emergency lanterns glowed in the corners. Nyara sat rocking Sol with a softness that made the whole room feel less like a battlefield. She whispered in Portuguese, something that might have been a lullaby or a prayer, and Rhea stood in the kitchen, her hands braced against the counter, the microtape lying between her and Marisol like a loaded gun. Marisol leaned against the kitchen table, her breath uneven, her skin clammy under the heat of a body failing slowly and silently. She looked more like a memory than a person. Still, her voice came out smooth at first, measured, almost even. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said. "It wasn't supposed to go that far." Rhea didn't move. "You forged my death certificate," she said, without looking at her. "You erased me." Marisol shifted in her seat. "I didn't erase you. The world was already ready to believe you did it. I just let them." The justification cracked something small inside Rhea, but she didn't let it show. "You handed me the tape," she continued, quieter. "You said it would protect us, but you made it." Marisol's hands curled around the base of her glass. "I used fragments," she admitted. "Calls, voicemails, that old recorder Mom kept. You talked so much back then, it wasn't hard to patch together something that sounded." She hesitated. "Convincing," that word lit a fuse. Rhea turned, fully now, eyes dark and direct. "Convincing enough to sentence me to 14 years. You didn't just bury me, Marisol. You trained for it." The wind howled louder outside, and somewhere in the house, a window creaked against the frame. Hollis passed behind them, adjusting the lantern in the living room, but said nothing. He could feel the temperature shift. This wasn't a conversation, it was a collapse. I was tired of being second, Marisol said suddenly, and her voice wasn't smooth anymore. It was brittle. You always had Mom's attention. You had the house, the legacy, even when you didn't want it. I wanted something that was mine, Rhea laughed, a bitter, breathless sound. So you took everything that was mine instead. Marisol didn't deny it. I needed a clean break. Harker promised protection, said the policy would change everything. And then when the boat sank, I had to decide sink with it or swim. Rhea shook her head, numb. So you swam. Over my name, my life. Marisol pressed her fingers against her eyes. I didn't know how long it would last. I thought I'd eventually fix it. Rhea leaned in. You got rich. You got famous. You got awards for pretending to grieve me. And now you're dying, and you think you can unburden yourself? Marisol looked up, and her expression flickered not remorse, but exposure. Yes, she said, because I can't carry it anymore. And then, like a knife slipped into the conversation, the word came. I spliced the voice, she said. I practiced your cadence. I played old tapes, over and over, until I could hear how you breathed between words. That's how I knew which clips to use. Rhea went still. Hollis, standing in the doorway now, stiffened. Marisol kept talking, not realizing the hole she'd opened. I even rehearsed with Edwin. We layered it like dialogue. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. The moment they heard your voice on that recording, it was over. She took a breath, her voice hoarse now. I used that same skill to charm every donor who paid for my second life. She said it all with the carelessness of someone who'd learned to call cruelty a skill set. And in the corner of the room, silent and steady, the small nanny cam blinked. It had been Hollis's idea weeks ago, to monitor Saul's room in the main areas of the house during outages. Tonight, it had been left active. Rhea hadn't thought about it until now. But as Marisol kept talking, kept weaving her final confessions like a ribbon around her own throat, Rhea slowly turned her gaze to the camera and then back to her sister, empty-faced, unmovable. There was no scream, no slammed fist, just silence, and that silence carried more weight than anything Rhea could have said. Marisol faltered finally, realizing the absence of reaction. Why are you looking at me like that? She asked. Rhea didn't blink. Because you think this is just a conversation, but it's not. Marisol's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? Hollis stepped forward now, his jaw tight. It means we got it all. Marisol froze. Her breath hitched again, this time in something closer to panic. She scanned the room and saw the blinking light so small, so ordinary, and suddenly the silence collapsed into meaning. You were recording me? She asked, voice rising. You planned this? Rhea didn't flinch. You planned mine. 14 years ago, you staged a performance and called it evidence. You don't get to complain when the truth finally decides to record itself. For a moment, Marisol looked like a child caught lying shrunken, wide-eyed, exposed. But it passed quickly. She closed her mouth, folded her hands, and sat back. It won't matter, she said. People believe what they want to believe. Rhea stepped forward and picked up the tape. Then we'll give them something they can't ignore. And with that, the night held its breath. The storm continued to roar beyond the walls, but inside the lighthouse, the confession hovered in the air like smoke. Nyara still rocked Saul in the back room, unaware of the final blow that had just landed. Hollis stood watchful, alert, the protector of something he no longer doubted. And Rhea, she didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. There was no celebration in this moment, only the sharp, precise awareness that something irreversible had happened. Marisol had confessed not just to the crime, but to the performance of it, and she had done it in front of the one person who refused to disappear. The lighthouse had once guided ships home through storm and shadow. Tonight, it had recorded the undoing of a lie. And Rhea, standing in its heart, finally saw what it meant to be believed, not because she screamed the loudest, but because the truth, when spoken in the right room, speaks for itself. Marisol looked at her one last time, her mask fully gone, her body small in the failing light. And that was when she knew too late that she hadn't confessed to a sister. She'd confessed to a machine that does not forgive. The explosion didn't come with fire. It came with paperwork and silence breaking in courtrooms and inboxes. Once the clinic submitted the recording to the appeals court, Lark barely slept, filing emergency motions, attaching the forged audio as Exhibit A, and pushing for the reopening of a case that had been cold and rotten for over a decade. The microtape, once a tool of Rhea's undoing, became her weapon. Experts analyzed the splice, cross-referenced the dispatch anomalies, and confirmed the confession had been faked with precision, designed not only to deceive, but to destroy. The judge, once a name on the verdict that sealed her fate, now read her exoneration aloud in open court. The words came slowly, syllables landing like soft punches after a long war. Rhea stood there, listening, her hands clenched, her chest tight, expecting the satisfaction of justice, but what arrived was something stranger. Not joy, not triumph, just grief. Grief for time, for youth, for all the versions of herself that would never live again. When the final statement was read, "You are hereby declared innocent of all charges," the room did not erupt. It exhaled, like the truth itself had been holding its breath. Outside the courthouse, Kel Madsen waited with a weathered cap twisted between his fingers. He didn't try to justify what he hadn't done, didn't offer excuses for the years he stayed silent. He just said, "I was wrong, and I'm sorry," and in that rare simplicity, Rhea heard more honesty than she'd gotten in half a lifetime. Hollis, meanwhile, handed in his badge before the department could tear it from him. He didn't ask for a parade, didn't linger for farewell drinks or speeches. He walked away from the station with the same quiet defiance he'd used to dig through records in the dark. For him, helping Rhea wasn't about redemption, it was about righting a scale too long tilted by comfort and cowardice. Nyara, ever the silent backbone, received a letter from an advocacy group offering her a path toward legal stability. She read it once, then again, then broke down in Rhea's arms, her sobs trembling not from fear but release. The woman who had once feared every knock on the door now cried openly, and that vulnerability felt like its own kind of victory. In the end, the system hadn't saved them. They had dragged themselves free by refusing to disappear. When they returned to the lighthouse, Rhea expected to feel like a visitor, but something had shifted. She stepped into the room that had once been hers, smaller now, repainted, filled with remnants of someone else's life, and found a small sheet of paper taped to the wall. A child's scribble, wild and colorful, impossible to decipher unless you were looking closely. Below it, in gentle handwriting, Nyara had written one word: home. Rhea stared at it until her vision blurred, not from tears, but from the ache that came with being seen. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't an apology or a banner or a party. It was a declaration, quiet but steady: you are not forgotten. You are not alone. And in that moment, Rhea felt her ribs loosen. She sat on the bed she once dreamed of escaping, and realized she wasn't haunted by the past anymore. She had outlived it. Hollis came in with a toolbox, joking about a leaky pipe he needed to fix. Nyara followed with tea. Saul, toddling behind, offered her a broken toy and called her Rhea, the closest he could get to her name. And that, somehow, mattered more than the exoneration ever could. Later that night, with the sky finally clear and the storm now just a rumor behind them, Rhea stood at the base of the lighthouse stairs. She hesitated not from fear, but from reverence. For years, this place had been a ghost in her mind, a symbol of everything taken and everything left behind. But tonight, it was something else. She climbed the steps slowly, not looking back, her fingers brushing the walls as if anchoring herself to the present. Hollis waited halfway up, carrying Saul in one arm, the boy half asleep and humming nonsense against his shoulder. Nyara followed behind, quiet but steady, her presence like gravity. At the top, they stood together. No speeches, no cameras, just the click of switches and the soft hum of the old mechanisms waking up. The beacon flickered once, then again, then roared to life in a wide arc over the sea. It didn't need ships to guide. It wasn't about warning others. It was about reclaiming what was once stolen. Light, after all, wasn't just for safety. It was for remembrance. And the lighthouse, ancient and stubborn, remembered her name now. As the beam circled, Rhea knelt beside Saul. He reached for her with a sleepy little grunt, and she lifted him into her arms. The gesture was instinctive but whole, no flinch, no delay. He rested against her like he'd always belonged there. In that moment, Rhea felt something shift deep inside, not just healing, but anchoring. The lighthouse had once watched over her family, then betrayed her through silence, then became a symbol of everything she couldn't touch. But now, it stood witness again, to truth, to rebuilding, to forgiveness that did not excuse but endured. Nyara brushed her hand against Rhea's arm and smiled, not asking for anything, just being there. Hollis looked at them both, then looked out toward the sea. The future was uncertain, of course, but uncertainty didn't scare Rhea anymore. It felt earned. It felt honest, and it felt like something she could shape, one day at a time, without apology. And so, as the light cut across the ocean once more, sweeping its memory over the water like a silent vow, Rhea held Saul a little tighter and whispered, "You're safe." The words weren't just for him. They were for her. For every version of herself that had waited in silence, in grief, in fury, for someone to see her. She had survived the erasure. She had rewritten herself in the presence of those who chose to witness her. And now, finally, the lighthouse knew her name. It had failed her once, but now it kept the promise. What did you think Rhea should have done the moment she saw strangers living in her lighthouse and a document claiming she was dead? Was Hollis right to risk his badge? And did Nyar's quiet kindness change everything? Tell us in the comments. On a scale of 0 to 10, what rating would you give this story, and which scene hit you the hardest? The forged voice, the confession caught on camera, or the final beacon lit again? Don't forget to subscribe to Deb's Story Haven and turn on notifications for more emotional stories with twists, justice, and new beginnings.